Hey everybody, great to be learning with you today as we begin our study of the Malacha of Koteiv, writing, part of our Spotlight series on the 39 Melachot of Shabbat. In today's lesson, we'll have a chance to take a look at two things. First, we'll explore from a biblical perspective why the Malacha of Koteiv makes the list of 39, and what kinds of actions a person has to do in order to violate this law, mida oraita, on a Torah level. Next, we'll take a look at some very unusual behaviors, believe me when I tell you they're unusual, that even though they may look like an act of writing, don't technically violate the law of Koteiv on a Torah level, instead only violate the law on a rabbinic level, midei rabbanan. So the act of Koteiv, or writing, has something in common with all of the other melachot that make the list of 39, and that is that it has something to do with the maintenance and the construction of the Mishkan. The Mishkan was constantly reassembled and disassembled and reassembled and disassembled as the Jewish people traveled throughout the desert. And to make that process of reassembly easier and more seamless, the carriers of the Mishkan would put marks on the edges of the beams, both the outer walls, the perimeter walls, which you see in front of you here, as well as internal walls that set apart certain vessels of the Mishkan from one another. So one reason why these markings were placed was to make the act of reassembly easier, but there's actually a second reason. You see, certain parts of the Mishkan had enhanced Kedusha, higher levels of sanctity than other places. And that's because those vessels that were contained within certain areas of the Mishkan had enhanced status themselves. So, for example, the Mizbeach, which had an enhanced status of all of the Klei HaMishkan, all of the Mishkan's vessels, was imbued with a higher level of Kedusha and spread that Kedusha out to the entire area in which it was contained. Therefore, any beam that separated that particular vessel of the Mishkan, like the Mizbeach, away from other parts of the Mishkan, was imbued with a certain level of Kedusha as well. So to ensure that those beams, which were sanctified with a higher level of Kedusha, made their way back to their original place, so that every single time the Mishkan was rebuilt, those beams would be put back in their original place in the areas with enhanced Kedusha, markings were placed on the beams so that, number one, reassembly could be made easier, and so that beams with a higher level of Kedusha, with an enhanced status, could be returned to their rightful place. For this reason, Koteiv, writing, is part of the 39 Melachot of Shabbat because it too, like the other Melachot, has its origins in the construction and maintenance of the Mishkan. The Mishnah is going to turn now its attention on certain things that do not meet the standard of Koteiv mida oraita. And in order to meet the standard of Koteiv mida oraita, you really have very specific parameters, which you see in front of you here. A person would have to write two letters. There's some discussion in the Mishnah about whether those two letters, written side by side, have to form something intelligible, like a word, or could just be two random letters placed next to each other. Further, the act of Koteiv has to be done with a certain amount of normalcy, in the manner in which a person would typically perform an act of writing. So for a righty, that means writing with one's right hand, and for a lefty, writing with one's left hand. If you wrote with your less dominant hand, that technically would not be a violation of Koteiv mida oraita, but rather only Koteiv midei rabbanan. The Mishnah is going to now give some examples about things that fall under the parameters of Koteiv midei rabbanan, starting with a davar she'eno mitkayem, or a substance that is non-enduring, that does not stick the way ink sticks and stays behind after you write with it and compose it. So here the Mishnah presents something called mashkin, which is the juice of fruits that are typically squeezed, juices like mulberry juices or even grape juices. Those juices have a dark color and a dark finish that looks like ink, but even though it is dark like ink, is not permanent like ink, and therefore is only liable midei rabbanan, not midei oraita. Similarly, mei peirot, the juice of fruits that are not typically squeezed, strawberry juices, pomegranate juices, blueberry juices, which even though today are quite fashionable and high in antioxidants, do not make the Mishnah's list of things that are typically squeezed. They too, even though they can be used to write with, technically, lack a certain permanence and therefore do not meet the standard of Koteiv midei oraita and only fall under the category of Koteiv midei rabbanan. The Mishnah gives another example of a davar she'eno mitkayem, and that is avak drachim, or the dust of the earth or the dust of the street. If a person is walking and takes his finger, for example, and draws letters in the sand, that is not a violation of kotev midoraita, but only kotev midorabanan, since the sand with which one writes is not permanent and can easily be changed back into its original state. And finally, the Mishnah presents a last example of a davar she'eno mitkayim, and that is writing on anything that would not retain the writing past a certain point. So, for example, writing on a vegetable, which may last momentarily but will not last long term, is also considered a davar she'eno mitkayim, because the vegetable's residue and natural secretions will eventually erode any writing that is on the vegetable itself. And so for that reason, the Mishnah rules as follows. Koteiv b'mashkin, if you write with the juice of fruits that are typically squeezed, or mei peirot, the juice of fruits that are not typically squeezed, avak drachim, the dust of the earth, avak sofrim, the ink that with which a scribe writes typically has some dust residue that settles at the bottom of the inkwell. And if a scribe were to somehow use that to write with, that also lacks permanence and would not be considered a davar she'eno mitkayim. Chol davar she'eno mitkayim, says the Mishnah, is patur. It is only a violation of kotev midorabanan. It is not a violation of kotev midoraita because it lacks permanence. And part of the act of writing, at least as far as the Mishkan was concerned, was that it be of a permanent nature. Because imagine if the writings and the markings on the beams in the Mishkan lacked permanence, it wouldn't achieve the objective of reassembling the Mishnah easily. And so the first rule we learn out of kotev midoraita is that it has to be something that is done with permanence. Something that is impermanent, something that is not enduring, would not qualify as kotev midoraita, but rather only kotev midorabanan. The Mishnah now turns its attention to one other exemption, and that is shinoi, and unusual behavior. And here we look at a few examples that the Mishnah brings, which are highly irregular behaviors of writing with one's foot, with one's mouth, holding a writing instrument between one's elbows and writing that way, or even holding a pen with the tip facing towards you and then rotating your wrist in a 180 fashion so that you're writing with your wrist protracted outwards. All of those are examples of shinuyim, of unusual methods of writing, that if one were to write in such a fashion, even if he were to write 2 letters that were intelligible, that would only be a violation of kotev midorabanan, since it lacks any regular features. Similarly, the Mishnah presents a few other cases of unusual situations. Even though one would write in a typical fashion, these cases that the Mishnah brings would not be considered kotev midoraita, but rather only kotev midorabanan. One case the Mishnah brings here is katav ot achat samuch lektav. Let's say I wrote a letter before Shabbat, the black letter chet, and then on Shabbat itself, I wrote a letter hey next to it in green. Now, those 2 letters combined form the 2-letter rule that would be required to violate kotev midoraita. However, since only one of those letters was formed on Shabbat itself, this is not considered kotev midoraita, rather only kotev midorabanan. Similarly, if one had previously sketched the outlines of letters and then filled them in on Shabbat like this, katav al gabe ktav, writing on top of something that's already written, that too would only be a violation of kotev midorabanan, not kotev midoraita, since the basic contour of those letters had already been formed. And finally, if a person were to attempt to write 1 letter, for example, in ktav ashurit, which is the method of calligraphy used by scribes to write the Sefer Torah, to write tefillin, and all dvarim shebekadusha, holy artifacts. As you can see over there, the letter chet is essentially, on your left, is essentially composed of 2 letter zayins, except it has a little bridge on top of it, as you can see over here. And so the letter chet, if one were attempting to write that letter chet, and in the process did not complete that little bridge on top, thereby producing 2 letter zayins, in essence, that too would not be a violation of kotev midoraita, rather only kotev midorabanan, since even though he essentially wrote 2 letters, which would be kotev midoraita, his intent was only to write 1 letter, and intention plays a critical role in kotev. So as we've seen here, there are 3 real factors that come about when deciding whether something is a violation of kotev midoraita or not. The first is intentionality. The second is whether or not there was something enduring about it. If the substances that a person used were not of an enduring nature, then they are not subject to kotev midoraita, but rather to the lesser penalty of kotev midorabanan. And finally, in addition to being intentional and in addition to using an enduring substance, a person would have to also use a typical normal fashion of writing, not an aberrant way of writing, in order to violate Koteiv Midaraita, not be subject to Koteiv Midarabanan. And so these three principles are principles that we'll explore some more together when we return to class. Looking forward to going a little bit deeper into the topic of Koteiv Midaraita versus Koteiv Midarabanan when we return together.